A clunky lifesaver. The wild story of the M3 Lee tank in World War II. Picture this. It's 1941, and the world is on fire. Nazi Germany is steamrolling through Europe, and the Soviet Union is reeling from devastating losses. Across the Atlantic, the US is waking up to the reality that it can't sit this war out. Enter the Lend-Lease program, a game-changer that sent everything from canned beans to fighter planes to the Allies. Among the first shipments, a weird, tall tank with 2 guns that looked like it belonged in a museum rather than a battlefield. Meet the M3 Lee, a machine that was outdated the day it rolled off the assembly line but still managed to make a dent in the biggest war in history. Why should you care about this clunky tank? Because it's a story of making do with what you've got, of nations coming together, and of soldiers turning a flawed machine into a tool for survival. In this massive tale, we'll explore how the M3 Lee came to be, why it was such a hot mess, and how it helped the Allies buy precious time. I'll throw in some economic context, personal reflections, and stories from the front lines to keep you glued to the page. Let's dive in. Chapter 1. Lend-Lease, the US steps up. To get why the M3 Lee ended up on battlefields from North Africa to the Soviet steppes, we need to talk about Lend-Lease. Signed into law in March 1941, this program was America's way of supporting the Allies without jumping into the war headfirst. The idea was simple. The US would lend or lease supplies to countries fighting the Axis powers, like Britain and the Soviet Union. In reality, it was a lifeline. According to the National WW2 Museum, the US sent over $50 billion worth of goods, about $700 billion in today's dollars, to the Allies, including 400,000 trucks, 13,000 tanks, 11,000 planes, and tons of food and fuel. In 1941, though, the US wasn't ready to churn out cutting-edge tanks like the M4 Sherman. Its factories were still gearing up for war, and the military was stuck with whatever was on hand. That's where the M3 Lee comes in. It wasn't a dream machine, it was a stopgap, a tank that could be shipped now to help allies who were desperate for anything that could shoot and move. For the Soviets, who were losing tanks like the T-26 and BT-7 faster than they could build them, the M3 was better than nothing. And in war, better than nothing can mean everything. I can't help but imagine what it was like for a Soviet tank crew, watching this odd American tank roll off a ship in Murmansk. They're probably thinking, what the heck is this thing? But when you're up against German panzers and your own tanks are burning wrecks, you take what you can get. That's the M3 Lee's story in a nutshell. A tank that showed up when it was needed most. Chapter 2. Building the M3, a race against time. Let's rewind to 1940. Europe's in chaos, France has fallen, and the US military is staring at its own tanks, like the M2 Medium, and realizing they're basically scrap metal compared to German panzers. The US needed a new medium tank, and it needed it yesterday. So, engineers at the Aberdeen Proving Ground teamed up with big names like Chrysler, American Locomotive Company, and Baldwin Locomotive Works to create something better. The result? The M3 Lee, named after Confederate General Robert E. Lee. The British, who got a modified version, called it the Grant after Union General Ulysses S. Grant, kicking off a tradition of naming tanks after Civil War heroes. Here's where it gets wild. The US was so desperate that they started building the M3 before the design was finalized. That's like ordering a car before the blueprints are done. According to the US Army's Center of Military History, contracts were signed in 1940 and production began in 1941, with over 6,000 minutes and 3 seconds built by 1943. This rush led to some, let's call them creative design choices. The M3's main 75mm gun was mounted in a sponson, a fancy word for a boxy compartment on the side of the hull. To aim it, you had to turn the entire tank. A smaller 37mm gun sat in a rotating turret, but it was underpowered against serious armor. Why this weird setup? Because in 1940, the US didn't have the tech to put a big gun in a turret without making the tank top-heavy. The M3's armor was decent up to 51mm in the front, but its tall, boxy shape made it a sitting duck. Early models used a 340 horsepower aircraft engine. The Wright R975, which gave it a top speed of 24 miles per hour but guzzled fuel and could catch fire if you looked at it wrong. Later versions got diesel engines, which were more reliable but a pain to maintain. The crew? 6 or 7 guys crammed inside, trying to work like a well-oiled machine. You had the commander, gunner, loader, driver, and a few assistants, all squeezed into a rolling target. About 2/3 of the M3S built were sent abroad, mostly to Britain and the Soviet Union, where they filled critical gaps in tank forces. I keep thinking about the engineers who designed this thing. They must have known it wasn't perfect, but they had no time to mess around. The M3 was a compromise born of necessity, and honestly, there's something admirable about that. It's like building a raft in a storm. You use whatever's floating by. Chapter 3: The M3 in action, from desert sands to Soviet snow. Now let's hit the battlefield. The M3 Grant, the British version, saw its first action in North Africa in 1942, and it was a game-changer. British tankers loved the 75mm gun, which could punch through German PZKPFW-3s and early PZKPFW-IVs. According to military historian Stephen Zaloga, the M3 played a starring role in the Battle of El Alamein, where Field Marshal Montgomery's forces turned the tide against Rommel's Afrika Korps. The Grant's firepower and armor gave the Allies an edge when they needed it most. But the honeymoon didn't last. When German Tiger tanks showed up, the M3's weaknesses, its height, limited gun traverse, and SOSO armor, became glaring. Still, it kept fighting, especially in Southeast Asia, where it outclassed lighter Japanese tanks. In the Pacific, the M3 was like a bulldozer against Japan's Type 95 Hago tanks, which were no match for its firepower. In the Soviet Union, the M3, called the M3S, arrived in 1942 via Arctic convoys to Murmansk and through Iran. They fought in brutal battles like Vyazma and the Kursk Bulge. Soviet tankers had mixed feelings. On one hand, the 75mm gun was a beast, and the tank's roomy interior was a nice change from cramped T-34s. On the other, its height made it a magnet for enemy fire, and its rubber metal tracks got stuck in mud and snow. Soviet crews nicknamed it a grave for 7 brothers, because a hit could turn it into a fireball, trapping the crew inside. Despite the gripes, the M3 filled a critical gap. In 1942, the Red Army was bleeding tanks faster than factories could build them. The M3 bought time for Soviet industry to ramp up T-34 production. According to Russian military archives, about 1,400 minutes and 3 seconds were sent to the USSR, a small but vital piece of the Lend-Lease puzzle. I can't stop picturing a Soviet tanker, freezing in the Russian winter, trying to figure out an M3's English-language manual while German shells fly overhead. It's a testament to human resilience that they made it work at all. Chapter 4: The Economic Big Picture, How Lend-Lease Fueled the War. To really get the M3's impact, let's zoom out and look at the economics of Lend-Lease. In 1940, the U.S. economy was the world's largest, with a GDP of about $100 billion, per the Bureau of Economic Analysis. But its military was underfunded, with defense spending at just 1.7% of GDP. By 1944, that jumped to 37%, and the U.S. was cranking out tanks, planes, and ships like nobody's business. Lend-Lease was a massive part of this, funneling $50 billion in aid to the Allies. For the Soviets, Lend-Lease wasn't just about tanks. It included 2.7 million tons of food for 100,000 trucks, and enough raw materials to keep factories running. The M3 Lee, with its 1,400 units, was a drop in the bucket compared to the 7,000 T-34s built in 1942 alone, but it arrived when the Red Army was on its knees. According to a 2023 analysis by the Wilson Center, Lend-Lease boosted Soviet industrial output by freeing up resources. Trucks and food from the U.S. meant Soviet factories could focus on tanks and guns. Economically, Lend-Lease was a win-win. The U.S. kept its allies in the fight, delaying a direct confrontation with Germany. For the Soviets, it meant survival. I often wonder what would have happened without Lend-Lease. Could the USSR have held out? Probably, but at a horrific cost. The M3 Lee, flaws and all, was a small but crucial part of that lifeline. Chapter 5. The M3's Legacy. More than just a tank. The M3 Lee didn't stick around long. By 1943, the M4 Sherman took over as the US's main tank. But the M3's chassis lived on in other forms. The M7 Priest self-propelled gun, recovery vehicles, flamethrower tanks, and even spotlight-equipped models for night ops. The M7 Priest, for example, was a mainstay in Allied artillery units until the war's end, according to the Tank Museum in Bovington, UK. Today, you can spot M3s in museums across the US, from the National Armor and Cavalry Museum in Georgia to the American Heritage Museum in Massachusetts. They're relics of a time when every piece of equipment mattered, when engineers and soldiers had to make miracles happen with whatever they had. I think there's something inspiring about the M3. It's not the hero tank like the Sherman or T-34, but it showed up when the chips were down. It's a reminder that sometimes good enough is enough to change history. Chapter 6. A Soldier's Story, Life Inside the M3. To bring this home, let's hear from a Soviet veteran, A.T. Stachenko, who served in the 193rd Tank Regiment. His words, recorded in Russian archives, paint a vivid picture. We got the M3 Lee with some hope. It was big, with thicker armor than our BTs and a 75mm gun that packed a punch. But it didn't want to move. Those rubber metal tracks slipped in mud and got stuck in snow. The gas engine drank fuel like crazy and could catch fire from a spark. The commander's hatch was okay. But if the tank was hit and burning, all 7 guys were trapped like in an oven. That's why we called it a grave for 7 brothers. Aiming the main gun was a pain. You had to turn the whole tank. By the time you lined up a shot, the Germans had you in their sights. It was tall, boxy, and easy to spot. Repairs were a nightmare. English manuals, weird parts, special tools. We learned on the fly, trial and error. But when we faced anti-tank guns, the M3 could take a hit better than some. Its machine guns were great against infantry. In early 1943, after Kharkov, we had almost no tanks left, so the M3 saved the day more than once. This quote hits hard. It shows the reality of fighting with a machine that's both a blessing and a curse. It's the kind of story that makes you respect the people who made it work. Chapter 7. Why the M3 matters today. So, why should Americans care about a tank that was outdated 80 years ago? Because it's a piece of our history, a symbol of how the US stepped up when the world needed it. The M3 Lee wasn't perfect, but it was there when it counted. It's a lesson in resilience, in doing the best with what you've got. Plus, it's a testament to the industrial might of the US, which turned from a sleeping giant into the arsenal of democracy. I think the M3's story resonates today. Whether it's tackling a tough project at work or facing a personal challenge, sometimes you've got to roll with the tools you have, not the ones you wish you had. The M3 Lee teaches us that even the underdog can make a difference. That's the epic tale of the M3 Lee, a tank that wasn't pretty but got the job done. It helped the Allies hold the line, bought time for better machines, and showed what teamwork across nations can do. I hope this story grabbed you as much as it did me while I was writing it. Subscribe to the channel, hit that bell, and drop your comments below. What do you think of the M3 Lee? Ever heard stories from veterans or seen one in a museum? Maybe you've got your own take on World War II tech or America's role in the war. Share it. I read every comment. Let's keep the conversation going and dive into more incredible stories from history.